exclusive corporate sponsorship provided by American Century Investments. Support for American Masters is also provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television, and by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Rosalind P. Walter. Additional funding was made possible by and contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
On Washington's birthday in 1893, a great blizzard raged in New York. I stood on a corner near Fifth Avenue, watching the lumbering stagecoaches appear through the blinding snow and move northward on the avenue. The question formed itself. Could what I was experiencing, seeing, be put down with the slow plates and lenses available? The light was dim. Knowing that where there is light, one can photograph, I decided to make an exposure. After 3 hours of standing in the blinding snow, I saw the stagecoach come struggling up the street with the driver lashing his horses onward. At that point, I was nearly out of my head, but I got the exposure I wanted. Later, at the New York Society of Amateur Photographers, before my negative was dry, I showed it with great excitement. Everyone laughed.
For God's sake, Stieglitz, throw that damned thing away. It's all blurred and not sharp.
I told them the negative is exactly as I want it to be. What I was driving at had nothing to do with blurred or sharp.
What Stieglitz was driving at was a new vision for a modern world. To teach America to see, and photography was the epitome of a new way of seeing. He is known as the father of modern photography, but for this rebel against complacent acceptance of the past, photography was not enough. In Paris, a visual revolution was brewing in the early 1900s. A revolt against outmoded conventions in art. Stieglitz knew the future when he saw it. He would boldly introduce these avant-garde works to America to shock the world of the arts out of its blind attachment to the past and to open the eyes of America to the 20th century. This legendary figure, complex, difficult, full of contradictions, inspired either devotion or irritation. The gentlest and kindest of men, Stieglitz could be autocratic and brutally critical. Critics claim that his selfless devotion to art was matched by his devotion to his own fame. Stieglitz's noble idealism wrestled with his human frailties, for he was, above all, intensely human.
I was born in Hoboken. I'm an American. Photography is my passion. The search for truth is my obsession. From 1893 to 1895, I often walked around the streets of New York downtown, near the East River, taking my hand camera with me. I loathed the dirty streets, and yet I was fascinated. I wanted to photograph everything I saw. Wherever I looked, there was a picture that moved me. The second-hand clothing shops, the rag pickers, the tattered and the torn, all found a warm spot in my heart. Above all, there was the burning idea of photography, pushing its possibilities even further.
He was photographing, always trying to do something that he thought he could do that they would tell him you couldn't do. He was out there by himself.
Stieglitz was in his element when overcoming difficult weather and light conditions. He always saw himself as a rebel. Even as a young photography student in Berlin in the early 1880s, Stieglitz challenged the existing limits on photography. His wealthy father, who had been born in Germany, had sent him to Berlin to study mechanical engineering. Stieglitz quickly abandoned engineering when he fell passionately in love with photography.
The camera fascinated me, first as a passion, then as an obsession. I found that I was the master of the elements, that I could do things that had never been done before. I worked day and night, photographing, making prints.
And he must have been a very interesting pupil because he was always trying new things. You see, he set up his camera in a dark room and left it for a day or two to see if anything would be recorded at all, doing things like that that most students wouldn't think of doing.
With a generous allowance from his father, Stieglitz spent some of his happiest years traveling and photographing in Austria and Italy.
I worked like one possessed. People called me that crazy American. I didn't see why a photograph could not be a work of art, and I studied to make it one.
He sent pictures to every place where a prize was given. And when he got all the medals and all the prizes, there was half a shoebox full of them. I suppose he had become an authority by then.
When Stieglitz was called back from Berlin in 1890 on the death of his favorite sister, he was really not ready inside of himself, but he realized he was 26 years old, and he was aware that the family wanted him to settle down and to be married and all the rest.
Yielding to family pressure, Stieglitz tried to be a businessman and a husband. He would fail at both. In 1893, he married Emmeline Obermeyer, close friend of the family and wealthy heiress. From the start, their natures were in conflict. Emmeline, prudish, bourgeois to the core. Stieglitz, anarchistic, in full rebellion against the conventional society Emmy held dear. The disaster of their 1894 honeymoon in Europe forecast the disappointments of their marriage. Emmy envisioned the grand tour with afternoons at the great couturiers, dinners at chic restaurants. Stieglitz, interested only in photography, dragged his tearful bride to remote hamlets for peasant harvest scenes and to distant, lonely shores. Emmy was often miserable, but the honeymoon trip resulted in some of Stieglitz's finest early work. The birth of their daughter Kitty, who as a child was a favorite subject of his photography, did little to heal the rift. Stieglitz's passion for photography left him little time or taste for family life. With his camera, he roamed New York.
In my early work, I wanted to document the New York of transition, the old gradually passing into the new, the spirit of something that endears New York to one who really loves it.
A sense of greatness, a sense of being the metropolis of the country and therefore of the whole new world came into being in New York City. The idea existed that New York was typical of modernity, typical of the promise of the future. At the very turn of the century, another idea began to filter into public awareness, that the very greatness of New York City was awaiting its visual representation in the arts. A school of New York artists who would represent and reproduce into permanent form visual images of this very exciting and unique place.
It was the American Impressionist artists who first began to explore New York City as a subject. The Impressionist New York was the New York of Fifth Avenue, fashionable New York, the New York of Henry James, the new New York of elevateds and subways, electric lights and crowds, was painted by the Ashcan artists. They stood on the pavement, and they looked at the city, and they painted what they saw. But it was photography that would form our modern vision of the city.
I determined that photography would be accepted as art.
However, for many critics, photography was more of a threat than a promise.
Photography has become the refuge of every would-be painter too ill-endowed and too lazy to complete his studies. By invading the territory of art, photography has become art's most mortal enemy.
The photographer has discovered a machine to make his masterpiece of art for him by sticking his head into a black box and letting a machine do everything.
The fight for photography became my life.
Art was far from the minds of those making family snapshots early in the century, charmed by the new Kodak camera and its slogan. To the itinerant photographer and the professional intent on pleasing his client, the camera was a means to make a living. It was not art but social reform that sent pioneer documentary photographer Jacob Riis into the darkest slums of New York, and Louis Hine deep into the coal mines to shed light on the children who labored there. For all these, the camera was a machine to record faithfully what it saw. Yet to a small but growing number of photographers proudly proclaiming themselves amateurs, this machine could produce art. They worked to prove it by making their pictures as much like paintings as possible. Called pictorialism, their movement was the modern avant-garde photography of its time.
Stieglitz's photographs are significantly different from many pictorial photographers. Stieglitz often turned his camera on the subjects that were immediately around him, and most of his photographs were emphatically of their time.
1902 was certainly a watershed year for Stieglitz, a real turning point. It was then that his impatience with the lack of seriousness on the part of most of the Camera Club members really boiled over. He was being thwarted to impose, in his dictatorial way, his very high standards of what photography should be. And so he decided, early in 1902, that he would form an elite body of photographers, those whom he respected most. Edward Steichen, Clarence White, Gertrude Käsebier, to name a few of the most prominent. And this group was to be the photo secession, meaning essentially avant-garde.
Stieglitz believed that if he could find a talented painter who was also devoted to photography as art, it would help the cause. And Edward Steichen was that man. Steichen became his closest collaborator.
What drew Stieglitz and Steichen together was a passion for photography that started at the beginning of the century. Stieglitz valued Steichen as this creative, innovative, imaginative, energetic, wonderful young man. who produced beautiful photographs and was a painter. Steichen was Stieglitz's fair-haired boy, the wonder boy of photography. Whole editions of camera work devoted to him. He could do no wrong, so long as he was a loyal follower.
Stieglitz always knew the power of publication. Camera work was a major weapon in his battle for photography.
Camera work was, without any question, one of the most beautiful magazines of any sort ever produced. The reproductions, the photogravures were hand-pasted onto the pages. Everything was of absolutely the highest standard. Great seriousness, wonderful writers. The magazine had a tremendous impact. Each issue would have been passed from hand to hand as a treasured document. And this was something that has been of tremendous importance to many, many photographers in shaping their work.
Although camera work and the photo secession were internationally acclaimed, Stieglitz's true ambition was to create a great international salon of photography in New York, to rival or eclipse those of Europe. But suitable space was impossible to find or afford. With his close collaborator, Edward Steichen, a solution was found. They would arrange a continuous series of highly selective international photography exhibitions in some rooms at 291 Fifth Avenue, which they would convert into galleries. To this time, nothing like this had ever been attempted.
Both men, of course, took full credit for its being his idea, because each of them had that kind of a personality, and denying that the other one had that much to do with it. But the fact is, they really collaborated.
On the evening of November 5th, 1905, the little galleries of the photo secession opened an exhibition. It amounted to a miniature but superb salon of American photography, and it made photographic history. For the first time, Americans had a continuing opportunity to see masterpieces of photography from both Europe and America.
291 was a great success, but to my dismay, jealousies soon became rampant among the photographers around me. They had come to believe that my life was to be dedicated solely to them.
He quickly began to feel that they were becoming complacent, that they were assuming themselves to be much better than Stieglitz thought that they were, and that they weren't pushing their art, they weren't challenging it. And he began to think about exhibiting work by other artists from the time.
After Steichen went to Europe, he became more or less the finder of art materials, especially not photographs, to send back to 291. Alfred, who was there all the time, was able to take care of the selection of photographs and moved his energy and his days entirely to the gallery.
Stieglitz was in no hurry to go home. He made no secret of the incompatibility of his marriage to Emmeline. He complained of her lack of interest in his work, her hostility to many of his closest colleagues, that she resented spending money on ne'er-do-well artists.
Oh yes, you don't spend money on artists. They really are supposed to do better if they're a little hungry.
Stieglitz prided himself on not using Emmy's money for 291 or camera work, covering expenses with his own income from his father, subscriptions, and print sales. For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, Stieglitz rarely used his camera, promoting other photographers at the sacrifice of his own work. Now a shipboard experience would stir him to create one of his most memorable images.
In June 1907, my wife, our daughter Kitty, and I sailed for Europe. My wife insisted on going on a large ship, fashionable at the time. It was impossible to escape the nouveau riche. Ye gods. By the third day out, I could stand it no longer. I had to get away. I walked as far forward as possible. Coming to the end of the deck, I stood alone, looking down. There were men, women, and children on the lower levels of the steerage. The scene fascinated me. A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right. White suspenders crossed on the back of a man below. A mast that cut into the sky, completing a triangle. I saw shapes related to one another, a picture of shapes, and underlying it, a new vision that held me. I raced to the main stairway of the steamer, chased down into my cabin, picked up my Graflex, raced back again, worrying whether or not the man with the straw hat had shifted his position. If he had, the picture I saw would no longer exist. The man with the straw hat had not stirred an inch. The man in the crossed suspenders, he too stood where he had been talking. No one had moved. I had only one plate holder with one unexposed plate. I released the shutter, my heart thumping. If I had captured what I wanted, it would be a picture based on related shapes and deepest human feeling. A step in my own evolution.
"1907 was a memorable year in Paris, a time of ferment, experiment, and excitement. Picasso was painting the Demoiselles d'Avignon. Matisse's Fauve paintings were causing a furor. The great 1907 Cézanne retrospective was transforming modern art. It would be Stieglitz's real introduction to the Paris avant-garde.
That same year, a very important gallery in Paris was showing Cézanne watercolors, and Steichen and I went to see them. As we entered, I saw what appeared to be pieces of blank paper with scattered blotches of color on them. I asked the gentleman in charge their cost. I learned only later that he was one of the outstanding connoisseurs in the French art business. He replied, 1,000 francs. I answered facetiously, "You must mean a dozen. There's nothing there but empty paper with a few splashes of color." The man turned on his heels. I knew I had been absurdly stupid.
Stieglitz might not get it, but he was always drawn to the new and ready to promote it, especially if it was likely to shock a bourgeois public. The sculptor Rodin gave him that opportunity.
Steichen had photographed Rodin innumerable times and had photographed his sculpture. Steichen was very close to Rodin, sort of a foster son. He told him about the new gallery we had in New York and that we hoped to soon have an exhibition of his drawings. Rodin was very pleased and promised to let Steichen select whatever he wanted. This exhibit of Rodin's drawings was one of the first introductions of modern art to America. The show opened January 2nd, 1908, and caused a sensation.
We had the Rodin exhibition, which attracted a great deal of attention, favorable and unfavorable. Most of it was derision. The critics had a field day.
These drawings should never have been shown anywhere but in the sculptor's studio. They are most decidedly not the sort of thing to offer to public view, even in a gallery.
It was a very scandalous exhibition in the minds of many New Yorkers at the time, not only because the drawings seemed to be very unfinished, but also because they were clearly studies of nude models who had been prancing before Rodin in his studio.
Among the visitors to the Rodin show was a young art student, Georgia O'Keeffe, who would one day change the course of Stieglitz's life.
I was studying at the League, and one of the boys came in and said, "Didn't we want to go down to 291 and see the Rodin drawings?" All the teachers at the league were sending the students down there because they said it might be something and it might not be anything, but we shouldn't miss it. So we went down there. And that was what greeted us, this man coming out. His hair stood up on top of his head, and he looked very angry when he looked at us and said we wanted to see the Rodin drawings. Well, he said they're in there. And, well, I went in and I looked around, and I didn't see anything like anything I'd been taught. It looked to me like just a lot of scribbles.
Steichen wrote from Paris.
I have another crackerjack exhibition for you. Drawings by Matisse, the most modern of the moderns. Abstract to the limit.
Here was the work of a new man with new ideas, a very anarchist in art.
There are some female figures that seem to condemn this man's brain to the limbo of artistic degeneration and subhuman hideousness.
His line, its zigzag simplifications, evidently derived from the Japanese, is swirling and strong.
The New York art world was sorely in need of an irritant, and Matisse certainly proved a timely one.
When a Paris art dealer agreed to an exhibition of Cézanne watercolors in 1911, Stieglitz was curious to see how the pieces of paper he and Steichen had laughed at 4 years before would look on the walls at 291.
The box of framed Cézannes was opened, and lo and behold, I found the first one no more nor less realistic than a photograph. What had happened to me? I realized then what the years at 291 had really done for me.
291 was a space that artists could learn what this art was all about, and they could begin to run into one another. So a certain kind of social circle developed around 291 with Stieglitz and the art that he was showing at the center.
There wasn't any other place where people were not doing just academic things. And the things that you saw at his place moved you off into the world, just like his conversation did.
He collected around him groups of people who were among the most creative, intelligent people of their time, and not just artists, not just photographers and painters, but critics, poets, musicians. He brought all of these people together and fed on the extraordinary interchange of ideas that occurred in these spaces.
It was a kind of excitement and argument that Stieglitz put into the air. It was a place when you thought of something that would help you to take your own road, that was the only place that you could go to find it.
Part of the enjoyment that Alfred derived out of running the 291 was the sense of communal work with his friends. And he had always dreamed of making that kind of community. And to a great extent, 291 became that kind of a place where there was a free exchange of ideas. And this was a kind of ideal that really went back to his roots in his father's home, because Stieglitz grew up in a home where his father, who was a very successful merchant and was himself a painter, his father was very generous with artists.
Stieglitz's mother shared her husband's interests in the arts, as well as his preference for Alfred, their eldest son. This tender portrait reflects Stieglitz's deep feeling for his mother. Oak Lawn, the family's summer home at Lake George, always welcomed artists.
And Alfred, of course, then grew up in an atmosphere of respect, active respect for art, so that it was a natural thing for him to feel that this was something that he could carry on.
For visitors to 291, the cafes of Greenwich Village downtown were often the next stop. At Polly's restaurant in Greenwich Village, bohemian spirits provided New York's answer to a Parisian cafe. Here and in the Golden Swan, better known as the Hellhole, voices and glasses were raised, radical ideas in art and politics hotly debated. The endless talk found its way into print and publications vital to American modernism.
Greenwich Village became a kind of hub, a center for a new kind of culture in New York. It was in opposition to the dominant, what I would call brownstone culture of Victorian America or of bourgeois New York. And it was the next generation, a group of men and women who thought of themselves as a generation in rebellion against their bourgeois parents. And they wanted something more real, more vital.
The past needed to be criticized. The past needed, in some sense, to be overthrown. And so a sense of rebelliousness and indeed of revolution came along here. It was cultural as well as political.
Stieglitz can be included among those who identified themselves as anarchists. This anarchism for him meant a kind of intense individualism, going his own path, a kind of sense of continuous rebellion against his background, rebellion against anything that is conventional.
Stieglitz recognized in Picasso a kindred spirit. In 1911, Stieglitz gave the artist his first one-man show in America at 291. New York reeled from the shock.
Any sane criticism is entirely out of the question. The results suggest the most violent wards of an asylum for maniacs, the craziest emanations of a disordered mind, the gibbering of a lunatic.
The Picassos were on sale for between $20 and $40. I sold one single one, a drawing made when he was 12 years old. Another I bought myself. I was ashamed for America to return them all. The whole collection could have been had for $2,000. What a pity that these pictures of Picasso's evolution were not kept together in this country. I suggested to the director of the Metropolitan Museum that they should be. He saw nothing in Picasso and was sure that such mad pictures would never mean anything in America.
The Metropolitan Museum had refused to buy the Picassos, but in 1910, for Stieglitz, a far more important purchase crowned his 20-year struggle for the entry of photography into an American fine arts museum.
The Albright Gallery bought 15 photographs, accepting our condition that the photographs be hung on a regular basis on an equal footing with the other arts in the gallery. The battle has been won.
Although pictorialism had served to open museum doors, by the time victory had come, Stieglitz was convinced that it was the photography of the past.
Once he begins to show Matisse and Cézanne and Rodin's watercolors at 291, and he realizes that there's a whole new vision that is coming into being in the visual arts, he is really infused with that spirit of experimentation, that spirit of defiance of convention in the other visual arts and painting, that he wishes photography to align itself with that spirit.
It is high time that the stupidity and sham in pictorial photography be struck a solar plexus blow. Claims of art won't do. Let the photographer make a perfect photograph, and if he happens to be a lover of perfection and a seer, why, the resulting photograph will be straight and beautiful. A true photograph.
Camera work reflected the change in Stieglitz's vision. It moved away from photography to publish more and more avant-garde art. Resentful photographers canceled their subscriptions. Camera work was well known for publishing distinguished writing on the arts. But this new modern art demanded writing as radical as its images.
I plan to publish a special number of camera work showing the pictorial evolution of Matisse and of Picasso. But I didn't know where to find literary matter to go with the pictures. One day, a woman brought me some writing that had been rejected by every publisher in town. The woman handed me a manuscript about Picasso.
This one was one who was working. This one was one having something being coming out of him. Something had been coming out of him. Certainly it was something. Certainly it had been coming out of him. Certainly it was something.
I don't know the meaning of this, but it sounds good to me. What you have brought somehow fits into the volume I have in mind.
It was the first time anything of mine had ever been published anywhere.
The first real competition to the gallery at 291 came in 1913 with the Great Armory Show in New York City, bringing together from here and abroad the greatest collection of modern art ever seen in this country. At first, Stieglitz was very supportive.
In many ways, the Armory Show was really a vindication of all that Stieglitz had been working for the last 5 years. After all, here was a major exhibition of mainly modern European art in this country. And Stieglitz, prior to that time, had been the only person who had shown any interest on a really serious level of showing that work to the American public.
The greatest number of works were Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, Fauvist, and Cubist. 210 American works were shown. But it was the European art that caused a sensation. The papers carried cartoons and caricatures. The artists were either fakes, insane, or anarchists, or all three. Duchamp's picture, Nude Descending a Staircase, became a favorite target. The negative publicity drew enormous crowds. More than 87,000 people in New York alone. Patrons were paying large prices for the same European paintings that Stieglitz had returned unsold to Paris.
Work isn't art until enough noise is made about it, until someone rich comes along and buys it.
After the great success of the Armory Show, a number of dealers began showing more and more modernist work, and Stieglitz felt that he had accomplished what he had set out to do.
The Armory Show was not only a watershed for modern art in the U.S., it was a turning point for Alfred Stieglitz and American art. The European moderns had achieved success, but only a fraction of the works sold were American. America's avant-garde was still unappreciated and undervalued. The rebel needed a new cause, and it was waiting for him. He, Alfred Stieglitz, would lead the campaign for American art.
Not in the name of chauvinism, but because one's own children must come first.
American art had not been ignored at 291. Between 1908 and 1914, in what were called the biggest small rooms in the world, Stieglitz gave pioneer American moderns their first public recognition. John Marin, Max Weber, Abraham Wolkowitz, Arthur Dove, Marsden Hartley, Alfred Maurer. Knowing how limited were his resources, in 1909 his discerning eye would select 3 young painters with the greatest potential, to whom he would become mentor, protector, father, friend. 7 years later, he would discover the 4th. This time, the artist was a woman.
Well, it was Stieglitz's great gambler's hunch that if he could invest his hope and his support in these young Americans, in O'Keeffe, in Hartley, in Dove, in Marin. They were 4 very gifted individuals, and if somehow, through his efforts, he thought, if he could allow them to develop in their own way, that they would make a lasting contribution. And in the end, Stieglitz was right.
Beginning with John Marin, the story of the celebrated Stieglitz Circle is unique in the history of American modernism.
I first met John Marin in Paris in 1909. We had shown his watercolors at 291 the year before. His early etchings were in the Whistlerian manner, but his new phase was free, bold, and distinctly Marin. I said, "Why didn't you send something like that to me?"
When my dealers were here recently and saw this, They threatened to get rid of me if I did any more wild stuff like this.
I remarked, Mr. Marin, you are an American. You are an artist. If I had your gifts, I would see anyone in hell who tried to interfere with me. I had no idea that within a matter of months, when Marin came to New York, our lives would be interwoven, and the basis of a lifelong friendship would have taken root.
And he saw the potential in Marin to capture the energy that was to be New York. And it was Marin's great gift to that generation then to look out in the city and to begin to liberate his line and find his line moving in the staccato rhythm of the modern city.
If these buildings move me, they must have life. Thus, the whole city is alive. Buildings, people, all are alive.
He was very free with the medium, very free with watercolor. Everybody copied him at that time. And Stieglitz began pushing Marin and taking care of Marin so that Marin could be his own foolish self. I can't say it any other way. Kept him alive.
Arthur Dove's struggle as an artist would be the most difficult of the Stieglitz circle.
Before Dove went to Paris, he was an illustrator and earned as much as $15,000 a year. And after Dove gave up his illustration work to paint, his father said, well, if he can afford to give up such an income, he need not expect anything from me, and promptly cut off any support and cut him out of his will without a cent.
So Dove was really without resources, and he is living in Westport, Connecticut. He's working a chicken farm. He is putting in 12-hour days, heavy manual labor. There's very little time to work and to pursue many of these breakthroughs. Dove's first abstractions were unusual. There's almost no explaining how or why he came to it. But soon after the show of his work at the 291 Gallery in 1910, he picks a very limited palette. Greens and browns, earth tones, and he begins to paint the moment that nature awakens to him. And the uniqueness and the originality of that invention stunned New York.
Today, Arthur Dove is acclaimed as America's first great abstract painter.
Stieglitz felt it was vital to recognize the very finest artists. He was a passionate speaker who would go on with great charisma for hours at a time, trying to make the point, why buy the work of artists who are long dead, who cannot benefit from the purchase? Why not help artists who are alive, who need the money now in order to do more work? He kept a running fund into which he put money he received from the sale of his own prints, a percentage of the sale price of every work he sold from the gallery, some of the money from his own independent income, and used that fund to help artists in any way he could.
Like Marin and Dove, Marston Hartley discovered an utterly new world at 291.
I had come down from Maine with a set of paintings. I told Stieglitz that I wanted to show nowhere else, that the spirit of no other gallery was of any interest to me, and I swore that I could live on $4 a week.
Well, Alfred was so amazed to hear anybody be so simple as to be willing to live on $4 or $5 a week. He couldn't believe it, that he took Hartley on. Well, of course, Hartley got more than that.
For years, Hartley's ardent desire was to go to Europe. Stieglitz made it happen.
When he meets an exciting international group of artists, he explodes. He does his German officer series that have tremendous heraldic significance for the modern movement.
and it was like a brass band in a closet.
The fourth member of the Stieglitz circle would arrive through an intermediary.
On a dismal 1st of January, 1916, I was standing in 291 when in walked Anita Pulitzer, the young Columbia art student. I had noticed her in the gallery many times before. She was carrying a roll of drawings. She told me they had been sent to her by a close friend who is now teaching art in the South, with the specific request that she show them to no one. But, she said, they seem to belong to you. Examining the first drawings, charcoals, I realized that I had never seen anything like it before. All my gloom and tiredness vanished. Finally, a woman on paper. I told Miss Pulitzer I might want to show them here, and thanked her for bringing them to me.
Somebody in the washroom up at Columbia asked me if I was Virginia O'Keeffe, and I said, no, I was Georgia. Well, she said someone named Virginia O'Keeffe is having a show at the Stieglitz Gallery downtown at 291. And I knew right away that that was mine, because he had said that he was going to show them, and it had been almost a year. And I had thought, well, maybe he isn't going to show them. And I didn't think too much about it. But as soon as I heard he was having the show and he hadn't said anything to me about it, I went down to make a fuss about it.
Then a girl appeared, thin, in a simple black dress with a little white collar. She had sort of a Mona Lisa smile. Who gave you permission to hang these drawings, she said. No one, I replied. Still with a smile, she stated very positively, you will have to take them down. I think you're mistaken, I answered. Well, I made the drawings. I am Georgia O'Keeffe. I said, you have no more right to withhold these pictures than to withdraw a child from the world, had you given birth to one. We had lunch together. I begged that when she finished her next batch of drawings or paintings, she should please pack them up carefully and send them to me, express collect. I would take care of them. She left. We corresponded.
Anita, this morning under my door when I came from breakfast, there was a letter from Stieglitz. Such wonderful letters. Sometimes he gets so much of himself into them that I can hardly stand it.
Dear Georgia, before I left 291, all was darkness. I stood a while at the old back window. It is more marvelous than ever. The new buildings are full of tenants, and all the windows were aglow.
The plains, the wonderful great big sky makes me want to breathe so deep that I'll break.
Months later, at Lake George, I received a mailing tube with a 6-cent stamp on it. In the tube were watercolors. Incredible things. When Arthur Dove saw the O'Keeffe watercolors, he said, Stieglitz, this girl is doing naturally what many of us fellows are trying to do, and failing.
O'Keeffe has done more than paint. She has invented a language.
Being in New York again for a few days was great, Anita. It was Stieglitz I went up to see. Just had to go, Anita. There wasn't any way out of it. And I'm so glad I went. While I was in New York, he photographed me. I was very flattered, naturally.
For the first time in years, I've had time for my own photography. It's intensely direct, portraits. It is all 8x10 work, all platinum prints. No diffused focus, just straight goods. On some things, the lens stopped down to 1/28.
You know, that photograph of Dorothy True's leg, it was an impossible shoe and a good-looking leg, and her face as a shadow coming through it. It was a double exposure. And that was accidental. He didn't do that knowing what he was doing. But this leg with the shoe was like a portrait of her. He seemed to see into the person. He wouldn't think of working on anyone if he didn't know something about them.
His portrait of the young Paul Strand reveals Stieglitz's regard and affection for the only photographer chosen for the 291 Stieglitz group.
It was Stieglitz who became then the major influence on Strand's development as a photographer, as an artist.
Strand, this lens as you're using it makes everything look as though it is made of the same stuff. Grass looks like water. Water looks as if it has the same quality as the bark of the tree. You've lost all the elements that distinguish one form of nature, whether stone or whatever it may be, from another. You have achieved a kind of simplification that looks good for the moment, but is full of things which will be detrimental to the final expression of whatever you're trying to do.
He advised me to get rid of my soft focus lens. Stieglitz gave me the kind of criticism that you could say, yes, that's so, and you could do something about it.
This issue of Camera Work is devoted to Paul Strand. His work is rooted in the best tradition of photography. The work is brutally direct, devoid of flim-flam, devoid of all trickery. These photographs are the direct expression of today.
I was on the verge of doing the portraits, which I did in 1916. I did all those things with the idea of photographing people without them being aware they were being photographed. The technique used was a false lens screwed to the side of my reflex camera.
They're portraits that have an amazing power to them, also strength and dignity as well. These were photographs that Stieglitz felt were particularly powerful statements of what the new photography could be all about.
Bowls and other abstractions were the result of my seeing at 291 the work of Picasso, Braque, and others. I was trying to apply their strange, abstract principles to photography in order to understand them.
This Paul Strand number would be the last issue of Camera Work. The magazine had started in 1902 with pictorial photography, the advanced photography of its era. It ended in 1917 with the work of Paul Strand, the advanced photography of its time. Europe had been at war since 1914. 3 years later, America joined the Allies against Germany and Austria. Steichen, who loved France, his home for years, enlisted at once in the American Air Corps. The suffering he witnessed during the war would change him forever. Stieglitz and 291 were devastated by the war. Friends scattered. As a pacifist, and with happy memories of his youth in Germany, he could not join in the wartime fever and the anti-German hysteria. This refusal made him and 291 suspect in the militant wartime atmosphere.
I have finally decided that it would be sheer madness to continue 291. My family and I have been badly hit by the effects of the war and prohibition. I am compelled to give up both Camera Work and 291. I'm supposed to have a huge following and many friends. You'd be amused if you knew the facts. It was the winter of 1917-1918, a winter of coal famine, the coldest winter New York had experienced in years. I sat in a desolate, empty little space. I had nowhere else to go. No working place, no club, no money. I felt somewhat as Napoleon must have on his retreat from Moscow.
In this dark time, it was the growing intimacy of his correspondence with O'Keeffe that sustained him.
I didn't tell you that this afternoon I set Zoller ripping down more shelving in the old little room and ripping down the remaining burlap. The place looks as if it had been raped by the terrible Germans.
Before she left Texas, O'Keeffe wired Stieglitz,
"Starting New York tonight. My heart has wheels."
Alfred never asked O'Keeffe directly to come to New York while she was still teaching in Texas. He wanted it all to be her impulse. So he told her what would be available to her if she came to New York, that she would have a year in which to paint, and that she would have a place to live that was her own, and that it would be my mother's studio, which he'd already arranged with her. But he didn't try to persuade her outright. He said, "These are available to you, now you decide." O'Keeffe came to New York, and within a month, Alfred was living in the studio with her too, had left his wife, and their life together had begun.
Dear Dove, the lake is our great companion. We have it nearly to ourselves. These last 10 days have been possibly the fullest I have had in my life. Of course, the important thing has been O'Keeffe. She is much more extraordinary than even I had believed. In fact, I don't believe that there ever has been anything like her. Mind and feeling very clear, spontaneous, and uncannily beautiful, absolutely living every pulse beat. I am at last photographing again, just to satisfy something within me, and all who have seen the work say it is a revelation. It is straight, no tricks of any kind. It is a series of about 100 pictures of one person, heads and ears, hands, torsos. It is the doing of something I had in mind for very many years.
For a long time, he had wanted to make what he came to call a composite portrait of someone, a portrait that would record a person's many moods, their many different selves over their whole lifetime. Between 1917 and 1937, when he stopped photographing, he made more than 300 portraits of her.
You had to collaborate or you'd be in trouble. You had to sit there and you had to do what you were told to do. You get so you're helpless. He had a very rickety old tripod that nobody else would have bothered with. And the dilapidated looking cloth, and he had an old umbrella. And that was something that he got certain light into shadows with.
When Stieglitz exhibited the O'Keeffe portraits for the first time at his 1921 exhibition, 145 prints were shown. But it was the O'Keeffe photographs that caused a sensation.
In a part-by-part revelation of a woman's body, in the isolated presentation of a hand, a breast, a neck, a thigh, a leg, Stieglitz achieved the exact visual equivalent of the report of a hand or a face as it travels over the body of the beloved.
The exhibition made a stir. It put her at once on the map. Everybody knew the name. She became what is known as a newspaper personality.
Her art is gloriously female. Her great, painful, and ecstatic climaxes. All ecstasy is here.
Many of the critics seemed almost as if they were thinking more about Stieglitz's portraits of O'Keeffe in the nude than they were actually looking at O'Keeffe's own paintings. And O'Keeffe herself clearly felt burned by some of the critical reaction to her paintings, felt that the critics were overemphasizing the sexual nature of her pictures.
One of the most interesting things about Stieglitz is that he seems to have one foot in the 19th century and one foot in the 20th century. And that is at the same time that he believed in a rather revolutionary idea, and that is that women could be outstanding artists and equal in achievement to the male artists that he supported. He also was very committed to the idea that a woman was expressing a kind of sexual energy in her work, because at the time, Freud was just known in America, and he had a huge influence on Stieglitz's thinking, and thus interpreted these very innovative abstractions as the sexual expression of George O'Keeffe. And he began to promote her work in that way.
So she seems very consciously in the middle of the 1920s to have changed her art, not working so much in abstraction, which she felt had gotten her into some of the more Freudian interpretations, but rather to focus on close-up studies of fruits and vegetables. And of course, it was also at this time that she began to do her highly magnified views of flowers, which of course only gave the critics more fuel for their Freudian interpretations.
My work this year is very much on the ground. There will only be 2 abstract things. All the rest is objective. As objective as I can make it.
The decision to get married between O'Keeffe and Alfred is still a puzzle. No, she didn't particularly want to be married. Neither of them did.
And it didn't make much sense to me because I'd had all the scandal. It was much more of a scandal then than it is. Wouldn't be any scandal at all today. But at that time it was quite a scandal. Well, it bothered me. I got over being bothered. There wasn't anything I was going to do about it. So what? I always say I've had everything said about me that they could say except that I've died.
In the summer of 1922, my mother was dying. Our estate was going to pieces. All about me, disintegration, slow but sure. Dying chestnut trees. The poplars doomed too. I poor but at work, the world in a great mess. Just at that time, one of America's young literary lights, Waldo Frank, wrote that he believed that the secret power in my photography was due to the power of hypnotism I had over my sitters. I was amazed when I read that statement. I wondered what he had to say about the street scenes and the trees and the interiors. So I made up my mind to answer Mr. Frank. I'd finally do something I had in mind for years. I'd make a series of cloud pictures to show that my photographs were not due to subject matter. Clouds were there for everyone, free.
But the fact was that it was more than that, and it was his sorrow, his fear about his mother, who was obviously dying. He had to find something which was distant so that he could create some kind of emotional distance for himself.
He was speaking with the clouds instead of with a person or with a landscape.
What is of greatest importance is to hold a moment, to record something so completely that those who see it will relive an equivalent of what has been expressed.
He also began to see that it was a way of exploring abstraction in photography.
When I went away, he sent me some pretty sad photographs of the clouds. Pretty dark and gloomy. Pretty dark and gloomy.
One of the fundamental suppositions of the modern is a tremendous break with the past. And one of the things World War I represents is that kind of break with the historical culture of Europe. After the war, a wide range of American intellectuals searched for a distinctive American style. There were a variety of efforts.
Georgia O'Keeffe called it the great American thing. She said at one point, in the 1920s, everybody was chasing after the great American thing, the great American poem, the great American novel. They even wanted to paint the great American picture. And how, she said, with them jumping off and going to Europe was the great American thing ever going to happen.
For many years, Stieglitz had pioneered a lonely battle for recognition and support of American art and American artists. Now that everyone had jumped on the American bandwagon, he moved to assert his leadership. In 1925, the exhibition, 7 Americans, brought his artists together for the first time. It was a landmark event for modern American art and a dazzling triumph for the Stieglitz Circle.
These 7 Americans are explorers. Their creative self-discovery means nothing less than the discovery of America's independent role in the history of art.
The enthusiastic response to the show confirmed for Stieglitz that the time had come to open a new space. For Stieglitz, the intimate gallery was a new pulpit.
It is the American artist, by expressing his individual self, who'll give modern expression to the American soul.
That notion of a great American thing seems to me a very powerful way to think about what artists, modern artists in the 1920s were doing, whether they were the Stieglitz Circle or the Precisionists, or a little bit later, the Regionalists. They all had a similar goal, even though they approached it through very different means.
Stieglitz was far from pleased when his vision for American art was challenged by others, especially the Precisionists.
I like to call them the machine ageists. They were fascinated by Manhattan. They were fascinated by the elevated railroad, the bridges that went over the rivers, the skyscraper city. Modernity lay in New York City, and it lay very specifically in the new industrial and high-rise structures, in the new technologies that were proliferating at the time. Amongst those artists, we include people like Joseph Stella and his Brooklyn Bridge paintings, or his paintings of Broadway. Charles Demuth, his picture I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold, is a magnificent precisionist view of a rushing fire engine going down a street of Manhattan. Charles Sheeler did a whole series of photographs and paintings based on the Ford Motor Plant. They also were interested in what might have been known in Stieglitz's circle as sort of vulgar America, product America, brand name America. A young Stuart Davis paints 2 brand name products. The machine ageists thought of Stieglitz as a little old-fashioned in his point of view, in his love for spiritual content and emotional and expressive character to art. From Stieglitz's point of view, the machine ages were indulging in a love affair with base capitalist and materialist America.
What he really wanted to do was to raise the level of spiritual life in America above what he saw as crass materialism by refining the sensibilities of the American public through the visual arts.
Stieglitz, from the very beginning, saw himself in a kind of missionary sense. He became a missionary for a new art, a new America. He promoted a movement which he was at the head of, and to an extraordinary degree, his own history of himself became the history of modernism. And what we now have to look at a little more critically is his ability to articulate his own view as the view of what the modern in America was about. And it was exclusionary, even as it promoted what was unquestionably work of considerable merit.
He was autocratic, he was highly selective, he was not very democratic, and he really always maintained the notion that he was fighting for the right cause against a kind of dull and shallow public that couldn't really understand what he was saying. And he had devotees around him who were caught up in his evangelical fervor. Increasingly, they began to write about him as a kind of Messiah, a prophet, a figure who had, led the people out of the wilderness and into a new religion, a religion of culture and art. And he fueled that image of himself.
He tended to speak prophetically, even to speak in parables, perhaps in the mode of an Old Testament prophet. Clearly, he was driven by some idea of fame, and his manner did have all the marks of grandiosity. He felt he was capable of speaking the truth. That's a major conviction.
Though he viewed himself as a teacher, he was never able to take pride in his students when they left him. Having absorbed his lessons, they had to grow away from him, and he never recognized that. He felt always as though he was being betrayed, and this was great drama, because he had given them everything that he could, and then they left him, and right and left, and they said terrible things about him. He was very possessive without knowing it.
When those people might feel like they had matured somewhat and had come to a position where they assumed that they were more on an equal footing with Stieglitz, he had a difficult time often accepting that. And so throughout his life, he had a number of falling outs with people who had been very close friends. Steichen and Stieglitz quarreled and didn't speak for many years.
While Stieglitz remained always an elitist, Steichen increasingly became a populist. He saw himself as a photographer who could do work of a standard that could satisfy a Stieglitz, but that could reach an enormously broad popular audience. He was the highest paid photographer in the world, but Stieglitz felt that Steichen had sold out. And Stieglitz could never forgive Steichen for having done so.
Now, Stieglitz believed in art for art's sake. Of course, Stieglitz did not have to earn a living, and Steichen always had to earn a living. So Stieglitz could afford to believe in art for art's sake.
These varied aspects of the Stieglitz persona are all components of a very complex character, where the dark plays an integral role, just as it does in his great photographs. But there was a lighter side as well.
New York is madder than ever. The pace is ever increasing. But Georgia and I somehow don't seem to be of New York, nor of anywhere. We live high up in the Shelton Hotel. The wind howls and shakes the huge steel frame. We feel as if we were out at mid-ocean. It's a wonderful place.
When we lived up high in the city, he photographed out the window. And they were very good photographs.
What did he see out there?
Well, what did you see? You saw the city. And the city buildings. Sometimes it would be a building that was going up, and it would change from day to day or week to week, as you will. And sometimes it would be buildings that were nearby, and there was a building far off that came into the sky quite often. And when we lived up on the 30th floor and looked out, we'd be up on a level with the tops of the buildings. Our work was so different. But I was very interested in what he did, and he was interested in what I did.
When Georgia O'Keeffe started to paint the skyscraper, she even went so far as to write a letter to the critic Waldo Frank and said, "I want to be vulgar, so vulgar that people won't like my work anymore." And interestingly, when she came to New Mexico, she began to discover the forms of New Mexico. And at that point, she stops painting the skyscraper. Once she finds her New Mexico, it's as if she's found her America.
I'm having a wonderful time. You know, I never feel at home in the East like I do out here. One perfect day after another. I wired Marin to come out. He's having a great time, too.
The modernists were seeking to create a kind of painting that resonated with American qualities and American scenes. Subjects that only an American would paint. Marston Hartley was the first to come. Paul Strand came later with his wife Rebecca Strand, and then Georgia O'Keeffe came in 1929.
Stieglitz's heart condition, combined with Santa Fe's high altitude, forbade his coming to New Mexico. Since childhood, his summers were always spent at the family's Lake George property. There he found renewal and familiar, beloved subjects for his camera.
He always thought I wouldn't come back, and that was ridiculous. I never thought of not going back. But you couldn't get him to believe it. He made everybody miserable talking about it, I think. He hated it. I wasn't going to stay out here because I lived in the city with him. What do you think? I didn't go back to look at the Woolworth building or anything.
Stieglitz's disciples sought and found a new gallery space for him. The funds for an American place were raised for Stieglitz by Paul Strand and 25-year-old Dorothy Norman, whose devotion to the new gallery was matched only by her devotion to Stieglitz himself. Norman's complex role as Stieglitz's scribe and gallery assistant would result in books and publications that contributed heavily to Stieglitz's legend. And for a while, her role as muse and model would cause tensions in his marriage to O'Keeffe. The gallery opened shortly after the 1929 stock market crash, but in spite of the bleak market for art during the Depression, an American place meant that Stieglitz could see through the work begun at 291. That Marin, Dove, and O'Keeffe could be free to continue to experiment and develop. The fact that the only two photographers Stieglitz chose to introduce there were the young Ansel Adams and Elliot Porter testifies to the old man's undimmed eye for talent.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round. Just a wandering worker, I go from town to town. And the police make it hard wherever I may go. And I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
The Great Depression was one of those truly cataclysmic events in American history. No one could be unaffected by this. And there was a great effort to document the Depression by the government. The Farm Security Administration sent out some of the greatest photographers of our time. Extraordinary photographs showing what the conditions were in America. The whole intellectual world moved left. Writers and artists wanted their art to have something to say and hopefully even do with the crisis that the society was going through. Stieglitz, although a person of the left, certainly concerned by all of this, couldn't find a way to relate to all of this. And I'm not sure what the reason was, but one probably has to do with his anarchist spirit, his intense individualism, that was somehow out of place with the collectivist spirit that was emerging in the 30s.
Stieglitz's break with Paul Strand was of a very political nature. With the coming of the Great Depression, Strand, who, after all, had helped to establish an American place, turned away when he felt that Stieglitz was using an American place as an ivory tower. And Strand moved more towards art as a political tool, an idea that Stieglitz abhorred. And Strand felt that Stieglitz had become irrelevant.
Stieglitz increasingly comes to seem to younger photographers, especially those in the documentary mode, who came through the FSA, as excessively in love with himself, excessively egotistical, excessively arty, that may have had something to do with Stieglitz perhaps increasing sense that the artist has really no alternative but to withdraw.
The tone of Stieglitz's work changed dramatically in the 1930s. Stieglitz's work becomes cooler. In many ways, it becomes sharper and crisper, but many of his pictures from the 1930s have a very almost elegiac quality to them. They're beautiful, monumental images, but there's something almost sad and lonely about many of the photographs.
I feel my age not with sadness nor fear, but rather with a growing sense that I'm inadequate to the responsibilities that I've undertaken. I dare count on no one, and must save my energy so that I can at least follow through what I have begun.
Stieglitz laid down his camera in 1937. His late photographs at Lake George, among his finest, are equivalents of his love for this place. Scene of his happiest hours.
To the very end of his life, he died in 1946, he was still running galleries, he was still showing his artists, he was still making sure that there was criticism written about them, he was making sure that they were being sold to the best museums in the country. Right to the end, always seeing that within his soul was a rebel that refused to die.
Stieglitz stood for the freedom of the artist, and he did have a fierce kind of determination, a heroic determination, to be free, to stand at a place where it was possible to speak the truth as you see it in your particular medium. And for that, he earned a major place in the history of culture in the United States, in the world, in the 20th century.
To learn more about Alfred Stieglitz, visit PBS online at pbs.org. Exclusive corporate sponsorship provided by American Century Investments. Support for American Masters is also provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television. And by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Rosalind P. Walter. Additional funding was made possible by and contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.